currently accepting applications for 2023 postdoctoral fellows. The link is at the bottom of this slide. And coming to today's seminar, CRCS aims to design tools that center equity and sustainable deployment. And the seminar series is an opportunity for us to engage with and learn from a diverse set of perspectives on how to achieve this mission. So this week we have invited Dr. Niloufar Salehi, assistant professor in the School of Information at UC Berkeley. Her research interests are social computing, participatory and critical design, human-centered AI, and more broadly, human-computer interaction, with applications spanning healthcare, education, and restorative justice. And her work has been published and received awards in premier venues, including ACM Chi and CSCW, and it's been covered in VentureBeat, Wired, and The Guardian. And she's a WT Grant Foundation Scholar and also co-directs the Algorithmic Fairness and Opacity Working Group. And she received her PhD in computer science from Stanford University in 2018. Before I hand it over, please note that we'll be taking questions after the talk in Zoom and in person.
Space like child welfare or credit scoring or medicine, law enforcement, and sort of these issues that exist around discrimination, bias, and harms. And so there's growing interest in trying to fix these problems, right? Especially for us who come from, myself, I come from a computer science background, I care about these issues. And there's always this question of, okay, what can we do? And I like to start this talk with Tony Roth's series on what equity means. You might have already seen this, but it's always helpful for me to go back to it as I think about what are the issues and what are we trying to do here. So there are these 4 screens that talk about, inequality as this problem of unequal access to opportunities and resources. Equality as sort of an effort to make it so that the tools and assistance and support available is available to everyone equally. Equity would be if we thought about, okay, we do want everyone to have access to these resources. How do we make the tools and the support that we provide people identify and acknowledge that there are differences in their access, and how do we make those tools so that people have equity in access? And then justice is our approach to fixing the system. So thinking about how do we offer equal access and opportunities to people by fundamentally changing what is wrong with the system that was causing the inequality in the first place. And so throughout this talk, I'm going to talk a lot about justice. And this is, I like to bring this up at the beginning as sort of a grounding way to think about, okay, what do we mean when we say justice? And so there's all this energy into how do we move these complex socio-technical systems towards justice. And a question that I'm sure you've all thought about and comes up repeatedly is, what is justice even? And I'm going to say this right off the bat, there's absolutely no easy way to answer this question. I'm not going to pretend that there is. But one thing that I think is really helpful is to think through these different theories of justice that we do have and that we could use as frameworks. So today I'm going to talk about 2 of those. One is restorative justice and thinking about how do we address online harm. And the other one is distributive justice and thinking about approaches to student assignment. So I'm going to start by talking about restorative justice. And here, when I say online harm, I mean mostly interpersonal harm is the focus of this work. So we're talking about things like hate speech, targeted harassment, and a lot of the methods that we're going to use here are qualitative and speculative design. And this is work that I'm presenting on behalf of my collaborators and colleagues, Amy Hassanoff, Anna Gibson, Sijia Shao, and Shagun Jabber. So I'm going to start with a short story. In early 2017, there was an investigative journalist who uncovered a private Facebook group called Marines United, where there were lots of veterans and active duty Marines who were circulating nude and invasive photos of servicewomen without their knowledge. So there were lots of Google Drive folders that were linked through this Facebook page. They include dossiers of these people, including their private information, their names, where they live, as well as nude photographs and screenshots of their social media. So investigative journalist Thomas Brennan found this. He later wrote about it in the website Reveal. And this is actually quite common, unfortunately. So I think the reason that this particular instance stands out is because the coordinated nature and the scale of the abuse. But unfortunately, things like doxing, sharing people's private photos, sharing people's sensitive information is actually quite common online. So actually, some research by Pew Research shows that in the same year, and it's only gotten worse since then, 41% of Americans have been personally subjected to abusive behavior online. 1 in 5 have been targets of particularly severe forms of targeted harassment, like sexual harassment, stalking, revenge porn, physical threats, and sustained harassment over time. And Pew Research does this same survey almost every year. And when you look at the trends, it's getting way worse, and especially in the worst forms like sexual harassment and doxing, it's getting worse than it's sort of the thing that's getting worse is multiple forms of harm happening at the same time to people. So it feels like it's getting more and more coordinated. So following the investigative journalist's report, Facebook quickly closed that Facebook group. But similar ones immediately began popping up on the platform. So you had Marines United 2.0, 3.0, and another reason why I bring this example up in this talk is that there's a lot of things where we could say, oh, is this okay? Is it not? It's sort of a gray area. But in theory, at least, almost every social media platform bans sexually explicit photos, especially if they're non-consensual. So this is something that we could agree should not be there. Facebook agrees should not be there, but it's actually extremely difficult to stop. There's been mounting pressure from advocacy groups and victims of sexual assault. A lot of these platforms have promised to do better. Facebook actually rolled out in 2017 a feature called Not Without My Consent, which is a partnership with 9 organizations across 8 countries, specifically around the sharing of non-consensual images, which is often referred to as revenge porn. But what I'm going to argue here in this part of the talk is that despite all of the energy that goes into efforts like this, there's a fundamental limitation. So here's what the process looks like for Facebook's Not Without My Consent effort. What it requires is that the person who was the target of abuse share the images that they have with the company. Especially trained employee reviews the image to make sure that it's actually what the person claims it is, creates a digital footprint of it or hash. This allows image matching software to detect that the exact same photo was uploaded again. But there are major shortcomings to this process. The first is that it assumes that the victim has access to the images that were shared of them. It requires the victim to trust Facebook and Facebook's employees enough to actually want to share those extremely sensitive content with even more people. The image matching software is remarkably easy to fool, mostly because Facebook does not want to keep the images, it just wants to keep the hash, which makes sense. But then that means the very small changes to the image, like changing the background, can completely change the hash as well. But at a more fundamental level, I think one problem that exists in this and similar efforts that we have around online harm is that it takes control away from the victim. And it assumes that the most that a victim could possibly want in a situation like this is for that content to be removed from the website. And that's actually not entirely true. In fact, there's a common action called a preservation letter that if a victim goes to a lawyer and actually wants to take legal action on something like this kind of sexual harassment, they need evidence to be able to take to court. And so Carrie Goldberg, who's a lawyer who works with a lot of sexual assault victims, has repeatedly said that when she sends letters to social media companies asking them to preserve evidence, they not only ignore the letters, but immediately delete all of the content, meaning that there's nothing for the person to be able to prove. So that was sort of an introduction to thinking about this problem of online harm. And now I want us to dig a little bit deeper into how are we actually approaching this problem? And I'm going to argue that at a fundamental level, there's the misrepresentation of the problem happening. Facebook's process, and I don't want to just diss on Facebook, like all of us, the way we think about online harm suffers from this misrepresentation of thinking about the problem as the problem of bad content. So it's almost always the problem is the violating photo or the violating or threatening posts or the Nazi symbolism. It's the content that's the problem. And so once you've thought about it as a problem of content or toxic content or the bad content, then the solution automatically becomes content moderation. So what are some quick and easy and cheap ways that we can remove the bad content from the good content? And then we're done. But there are things that this way of thinking are entirely unable to address. So the limitation is that we're thinking about the individual pieces of the content as being what needs to be moderated, and not people and their relationships and the harm that's actually happening. And that's why I argue that content moderation can be helpful sometimes, but as the only mechanism used, it fails to serve the needs of the people who are most harmed online, or to change the conditions that are making that harm possible. And we need an entirely different way of thinking about what is the problem of online harm and how do we address it effectively. And so over the past few years, it's almost 4 years now, I've been working a lot on thinking about what are alternatives to content moderation. And one of the greatest resources that I've been building on are abolitionist traditions that have similarly challenged the criminal legal system. So if you're saying, I want to abolish prisons, I don't think that the criminal legal system is meeting the needs of people who are harmed, you immediately have to come up with an alternative, right? What do we actually do? Because harm is almost constantly happening. Especially after the George Floyd protests, there's been a lot of interest in thinking about approaches like restorative and transformative justice. And so one of the things that we've been thinking more about is how do we bring this type of thinking, this framework, into thinking about how do we address online harm. So first I'm gonna really quickly and briefly talk about what restorative justice actually is. So restorative justice thinks about harm as a violation of relationships. And when relationships are violated, violations create obligations. The central obligation within a restorative justice framework is to right the wrong or repair the harm. So the things that we need to do if we're going to approach a harm that has happened through restorative justice are to address the needs of the person who was harmed, hold the person who caused the harm accountable and support them to understand the harm that they've done and to work to right the wrong, repair as much as possible, and to involve victims, offenders, and community members within this process. And the primary tool for doing this within a restorative justice framework is communication or dialogue. So that was a really quick primer of what restorative justice is and where it's coming from. Most of the ways that it's been implemented so far have been through deeply connected and local communities. Like there are restorative justice efforts within schools, within churches or neighborhoods. In Oakland schools in particular, there's been one of the largest restorative justice programs that has led to 0 detention rates since it was implemented. But there's these really big open questions, right? If we did want to take this approach and think about online harm, where are we going to take it? How are we going to deal with all the issues that are specific to online harm, like anonymity? So that's most of what we've been working on, is thinking about what would this actually look like in an online environment. And some of the work that we've done falls into speculative participatory design. So we've been doing a lot of work with both people who moderate online communities like subreddits right now, and people who are transformative and restorative justice practitioners and activists. We've been doing interview studies. We did a really fun speculative design workshop where we brought actual cases of online harm. And we had people who are moderators and people who are practitioners, and we had them talk through what would you do if this harm happened in your community. And that brought up a lot of really interesting things around what are these different approaches different in. And so that's one of the main findings that I wanted to talk about today, is we found these three axes along which the moderators and the practitioners, the restorative justice practitioners, were different. That was the goal. So when a harm has happened, what is our goal in addressing it? The mechanisms for action that they used and their locus of intervention, where did they intervene? So one thing that I want to quickly note before I go more into these and talk about what each of these are is that it wasn't that, you know, all of the RG people were doing this and all the content moderation people were doing exactly that. They didn't fall neatly on the spectrum. But when we looked at sort of what actions were they mostly taking, what were their instincts, where did they go to quickly, it sort of fell on these axes. We did have a lot of moderators who were doing things that we would call restorative justice. So there were a lot of moderators who would go and talk to the person who caused harm, for instance. And we also saw restorative justice practitioners who were using rules, for instance, in some cases. So it's not really a dichotomy, it's more of an axis. But I think what's interesting in it is thinking about if you were thinking about how do I address online harm in my community, these are the axes that you need to be thinking about as you're developing your approach. So the first one was goal. And I think this was one of the most central ones, is what are we even here for? What are we trying to achieve? And one of the things that we found was that for the moderators, the goal was often maintenance and order. So it was like, this community, I want to maintain it. So they spoke about, you know, their responsibility to ensure community cohesiveness. They saw their role as setting a positive and productive tone in the community, and stepping in when things were going so bad, they needed to guide the community back to a satisfactory state. They strived to be very neutral in the decisions that they made and to have a consistent process and to treat everyone equally. So those were their goals and values. On the other end of the spectrum, the restorative practices aims to repair the harm. So they talked a lot about who has been hurt, what are their needs, how do we support them, how do we help and support the person who caused the harm to take accountability. In this case, sometimes it's a little bit confusing when we say support the person who caused the harm. It doesn't mean support them, you know, it doesn't mean back them. It sort of means, you know, it's better for everyone if this person understands the harm that they caused, acknowledge it, and work to repair it. So how do we support them in doing that? And to strive to repair the harm as much as possible. And then they also worked a lot to try to involve community members or people who are adjacent to the harm as much as possible in an effort to transform community culture and norms and prevent future harm from happening. So their intent or goal was sort of to engage in collective problem solving and self-accountability. The other axes along which they differed a lot was their mechanisms for action. So on one end of the spectrum, the moderators really cared about rule enforcement as their main mechanism for action. So they oftentimes moderated communities that had predefined rules. When someone violated those rules, the moderators would do things like remove the content, send a warning. In some rare cases, they would ban that person from the community. And they usually had a process that was predefined for how do we decide which have to choose. So maybe it was something like 3 strikes and you're banned. They used a lot of rule enforcement. Sometimes they also used automated tools, such as ones that ban specific keywords. On the other end of the spectrum, the restorative justice practitioners cared a lot about dialogue facilitation. So these are mechanisms that are semi-structured, adaptive, incredibly slow. So the practitioners that we spoke to talked about participation in restorative justice practices as being entirely voluntary. And they saw their role as facilitators. So this sometimes took the form of semi-structured dialogue, making people aware of the options that they had, the resources that they had. The mechanisms they used were also different for different practitioners. So it wasn't that there was one specific set of practices that everyone used, but there were some common forms. So Pre-conferencing was one form that they took, story collection and sharing, listening circles, survivor pods, which are groups of people who surround the survivor and try to support them and be their interface with the rest of the community or with the person who caused harm. Accountability circles, contracts were very commonly used in circles and conferences. And the final spectrum or axes that the two groups differed in was the locus of intervention. So where did they see where intervention should occur? And the moderators usually saw the content as the locus of intervention. So they focused a lot on the content. How do we find the violating content? How do we remove it? How do we ban violating user accounts? And on the other end of the spectrum, the restorative justice practitioners focus a lot more on people and their relationships. So one good way to understand this difference in spectrum is to think about the three central questions that these different groups ask. And with moderators, it was, what content has been reported? Is the content against the rules? And should the content be removed, demoted, flagged, or ignored? And the three central questions that guided the restorative justice practitioners were, who has been hurt, what are their needs, and whose obligation is it to meet those needs? So you can already see a difference in where the intervention is happening. So those were the three main axes. So the goals, the mechanisms that we use for action, and the locus of intervention. I'm going to talk a little bit more about how do we actually implement all of this. And one thing that I want to flag that I think is really, really important and came up a lot in our work is that restorative justice requires time, training, resources, and labor. And this goes completely against what we strive to do in content moderation, which is to do things quickly, efficiently, and at minimal cost. Restorative justice just does not do that. And so we have to acknowledge that using these practices, each harm case is going to be unique. It will require a creative response. And I actually think that it's quite revolutionary to think about the people who have been harmed, who are usually the lowest powered people in any given community, are the people who we should put at the center and care for. And so we need to think a lot more about, pushing platforms to spend considerably more resources, hire experts in restorative justice, trauma response, community accountability, anti-racism, and think about how do we implement structures that can actually center the needs of the people who are harmed. And also, how can we redirect resources to outside organizations and victim support groups? And so in thinking about taking the first steps to restorative justice, some of the work that we've been doing is digging more into that question of the very first question. So who's been harmed and what are their needs? So that's some of the work that we've been doing, is studying adolescents, especially in online gaming communities, and thinking of, and asking, which are notoriously extremely toxic communities, and asking about how are they harmed, what do they need after they're harmed. So I also wanted to flag a few papers, mostly from the University of Michigan, that have been doing similar work and thinking about how do we bring restorative justice and transformative justice, and how do we take the first steps to using these as frameworks. So if you're interested in this line of work, definitely check out those papers as well. But one of the things that I mentioned is so this is a paper that just came out at CHI, is thinking about, okay, what exactly are the needs of people who are harmed online, starting with adolescents. And we've sort of created this categorization of, the different types of needs: sense making, emotional support and validation, retribution, safety, and transformation. And then we started asking, what actions can meet each of these needs, and who are the stakeholders, who are the people who we might be able to use or get help for each of these needs. One that people are often interested in is the online platforms column. So what are the needs that the online platform has an obligation to meet and can actually meet? But there's also lots of other stakeholders as well. So we need education at a broader level, we need training, we need to be able to, every single one of us, know what harm is and what to do when it happens. Another interesting thing that has come out of this work is we asked all of the participants to sort of put on a timeline these actions that they say would meet their needs. And you can start to see some patterns of when are each of these needs more salient. So, sense making was one of the very first needs that people talked about. So especially working with adolescents, one of the first issues that they have is even realizing that they were harmed. And this is really, really hard, especially when you're younger and you might not have the resources or the framings to understand it. So some of our follow-up work is actually building a system that supports people in doing the sense-making process and understanding how was I harmed, how do I feel, how do I want to feel, and then what resources can help me get there. Another thing that we found was that emotional support and validation was there for almost every single person we spoke to. And that's one of our very big blind spots, is that if you think about the ways that we address harm, we almost never validate anyone or think about how do we emotionally support them. And so that's, I think, going to be a really important part too. And then the final thing is that a lot of people ended their timeline with transformation. And that means thinking about what are the structural issues, what are the things that enabled this harm to happen, and then wanting to transform those conditions as a way to not only stop harm from happening again to me, but from happening to other people. And I think that's another one of the things that we really gloss over when we think about harm, when we think about it as happening to individual people. We sort of lose that more structural analysis. So the two figures that I just showed were from this Kai paper. It was led by my PhD student, Sijia Xiao, and then we have two other work that's under review that will hopefully come out soon. But so these are the papers that I just talked about. I'm going to move on to the second half of the talk now, which is thinking about student assignment. And how can we take distributive justice, or this concept of people should have equity in their access to resources, to a problem that computer science and economics has been thinking a lot about for a really long time. So this is work that I'm presenting on behalf of my collaborators and colleagues, Samantha Robertson, Tanya Nguyen, Kathy Hu, Catherine Albertson, and Ashton Musab. And the question that we're going to look at here is the question of student assignment to public schools. San Francisco, which is very close to where I live, has the worst Black student achievement in any county in California. It's also one of the richest cities in the country. And partly the reason why this happens is that there's always been really, really high residential segregation in the city, which leads to really high educational and access segregation when people go to their neighborhood schools. In fact, it was so bad that the NAACP sued San Francisco Unified School District in 1978 for holding a segregated school system in San Francisco. They won. And so there was this long process of figuring out how do we desegregate schools in San Francisco, which has a long history. Eventually, at some point in 2012, well, a little bit earlier than 2012, the school district started to use an algorithmic system to assign students to public schools. But the general idea is that instead of having you only limited to the schools in your neighborhood, all of the schools in the city are open to all of the students in the city, so that equality that we talked about at the beginning. And then you basically put together a preference list of which schools you would prefer to go to, you submit that to the school district, and then the school district runs a matching algorithm, which a lot of computer scientists are very familiar with. It's usually one of the first algorithms we learn to assign students to these public schools. The district special assistant to the superintendent, when the new process came out, said that it's really, really simple. They just have to tell us where they live, what their choices are, and where they rank them. One of the board members said that in addition to the equality that we talked about at the beginning, so all of the schools in the city were open to all the students, they actually took it a step further. So they took it closer to the equity screen that we saw at the beginning. They said, it's not just that the schools are open to all the students, we're going to give a special priority to the students who live in parts of the city where, according to the census tract, they have lower performing schools. So they're saying, if you live in a poor neighborhood, we're actually going to give you a boost and prioritize you. So whatever schools you choose, you're way more likely to get into them than everyone else. So this board member said, for me, that is the bottom line of our desegregation goals. Neither option is as aggressive and that as I'd like them to be, though. So it looks like we have, this great system. Around 10 years later, the system was so bad that everyone was dissatisfied. And the San Francisco School Board voted to completely stop using that system and replace it with a new system. One of the things that had happened was that segregation had actually gotten worse. So over those 10 years, now you had neighborhoods in San Francisco that were more segregated. We had schools that were more segregated than the neighborhoods that they were in. Segregation had gotten much worse. You had some schools, schools that were in poor neighborhoods that were struggling so much to retain enrollment that they were very, very close to getting shut down. And if they did get shut down, then you would have entire neighborhoods in the city with no school. And these are some of the neighborhoods that are, extremely low resource. So it's not that people could just drive to another neighborhood to go to school. And then that's a really big disaster when you don't even have the basic access to education in one of the richest cities in the country. So one of the things that I'm going to start off this talk with is our study of trying to understand why the system failed. And a quick hint is that the system was making assumptions in its modeling of the problem that turned out to be not true. So here's what the system looks like that I just explained. The students come in, they have a preference list of which schools they would like to go to. All of the schools in the city are open to them so they can pick whatever they want. Sometimes schools also have priority categories. So the school might say, I want to prioritize siblings of someone who's already a student in my school. It makes a lot of sense. Or I want to prioritize underserved students or neighborhood students. And then it all goes through a matching algorithm and then assignments. So one of the very first questions that we had when we were studying the system is, what are the values and models of justice that the designers and policymakers of the system were hoping it would support? And why were those values not met in practice? So we did what's called a value-sensitive inquiry. We did a qualitative content analysis. We spoke to parents in San Francisco. We looked at and did content analysis of parent discussions on Reddit, in part because we guessed that there were things that parents were considering that they didn't necessarily feel comfortable telling us in an interview. We also went back and looked at all of the content that existed on San Francisco Unified's website. So any policy documents that they had, any official policies, community feedback documents that they had. We also did an analysis of the economics literature because that's the main literature where the use of these types of algorithms like top training cycles is brought into the school assignment context. And there's a lot of studies within economics about how does it work, how do we make it better. And then we also did a quantitative data analysis. So we had data from 2017 kindergarten preferences and third grade achievement data. So we put all of this together to answer these questions. What values and models of justice were the designers and policymakers hoping that the algorithm would support? So that was our first question. We found 4 main values. So the first one was transparency, predictability, and simplicity. The second one was equity and diversity. Third one was quality schools, so maintaining, the schools in the city. And the fourth one was community and continuity. And so, like I said, I actually think that when this process was first introduced, it was a pretty ambitious goal and a complete overhaul of the neighborhood system. So, that itself was a big goal. And I think if you think about it in a distributive justice way, you have, these basic principles, the equality of people in like rights and liberty, the equality of opportunities for all, and an arrangement of economic inequalities focused on benefit maximization for those who are least advantaged. So it seems like in theory, the system is actually doing all 3 of these things. But like I said, in practice, it didn't really. It made segregation much worse. And so the president of the District Board of Education said around a decade after the system was in place that our current system was broken. We've inadvertently made the schools more segregated. But it wasn't that simple. It wasn't all bad. So, the schools were getting more racially segregated while the neighborhoods were getting more racially integrated. But those who defended the current system pointed out that around 80% of Black parents, 80% of Filipino parents, and 61% of Hispanic parents did receive their first choice. So the goal of the system was for the most number of people to get their first choice, right? And it was especially trying to say the people who are least advantaged should doubly get their first choice. And it seemed like they were. when you compare it to white parents, only 48% of those people were getting their top choice. So that creates a dilemma, right? It looks like our goals of distributive justice were met theoretically with the system. In practice, the goal of people getting their top choice is also getting met, but it's actually making the schools way more segregated. So let's go over these values again. So what were we hoping the system would do, and why did we think it was going to do the thing we said it was going to do? So the first value was transparency, predictability, and simplicity. There are some reasons to think the system does this, right? The first is that there's a lot in the econ literature around how these systems are strategy proof, which means that you have zero incentive to lie about what your preferences are, everyone, because you don't benefit from doing that. So, you know, everyone should come forward transparently about what they think their top choice is. And there's a very clearly defined and explicit procedure for assignment, right? We could even rerun the matching algorithm and show you exactly what you got, the assignment that you got. So it seems like transparency, predictability, and simplicity is being met, right? At least theoretically. But when we actually looked at it in practice, we saw that it wasn't really. So one part of it was, you know, transparency, right? We found that there was a whole lot of distrust in the system. So someone said, I do think that there is a certain group of people who have enough affluence to benefit from the system and get their kids into a better place. When people perceived that the system was not trustworthy, they strategized. So no matter how much the school district kept putting out these policy documents and putting it on their website, you know, this is strategy proof, demonstratively so, you know, just tell us which school we want to go to. People spent a lot of time and effort into trying to strategize around it, and they perceived this inequality in it. The other part was that the matching algorithm itself was, you know, transparent and reproducible, right? But it was actually in practice extremely difficult to explain. And the more they like put different things into it, bells and whistles onto it to like nudge it towards being more equitable, the more it got difficult to explain and understand, and the more that people perceived it as being random and unpredictable. So to the point where most of the people we talked to, the parents, actually called it the lottery. So one person said, I'm not really that confident in their actual lottery system. It could be bingo in the background for all I know. The second value was equity and diversity, right? So we thought that theoretically the system should promote equity and diversity because everyone has access to all the schools in the city. And I want to, you know, really emphasize that that's a big deal, especially within the United States, where schools in a neighborhood are funded by the taxes of that neighborhood. So telling people that you can go to whatever school you want, funded by people in another neighborhood, is a pretty big deal when you think about equality of access. All students can also participate equally in the system. And we're not just like naive in thinking that that's by itself going to solve the problem. The system is also prioritizing underserved students. But there were a lot of issues with that. So theoretically, everyone could participate equally. There were a ton of barriers to participation, first of all. So we learned that parents spent weeks doing research just to figure out what their preferences should be, and not everyone had the time and resources to do that. A lot of the parents who were, you know, working 2-3 jobs just missed the deadline altogether because it's a ton of work to do that. There were also barriers to accessing the school. So even if theoretically I say, you know, go to whatever school you want to, you don't necessarily have a car. You can't really transport your kid. So there were a lot of barriers there. One person said it's like a full-time job doing all of the school tours. So people would go and tour the schools just to put together their list. There was also very limited impact from the priority category. While it caused a lot of political tension, because now white parents felt like, oh, you know, we're getting this huge disadvantage and everyone else is so advantaged. What we saw when we looked at the actual data was that there wasn't really a competition. So yes, true, you know, 80% of students of color were getting their top choice relevant to 48% for white kids, but the schools that they were picking were different. So a lot of the parents in the lower income neighborhoods were just picking their neighborhood schools. So there wasn't really even a competition there. So especially around barriers to access, one person said, so you're telling me the school is 3 blocks uphill and we're supposed to do that with a kindergartner and no car. So there were a lot of issues in equity and diversity. The third value was quality schools. So the economics literature loves to talk about how competition is going to increase quality, right? So we think about if you know, there's competition between schools and attracting students, that's automatically going to increase the quality of the schools. What we found was that actually the competition we saw was driven heavily by social signaling and stereotypes. And that because these are schools, these are public schools, they can't really attract resources to themselves if they're under enrolled and not performing that well. So instead of, you know, oh, we're not doing so well, let's do better, what ended up happening was, oh, we're not doing so well, oh, we're losing all our resources, sort of this downward spiral of now we're losing more enrollment, and then it made it really hard. So in one of SFUSD's policy documents in 2019, they said, our current choice system creates unhealthy competition between schools and can have a negative impact on schools' ability to build robust and consistent enrollment. And really quickly, the final one was that, you know, the value was community and continuity. You know, the matching algorithm prioritized neighborhoods, schools, and students. It actually, there was, you know, in practice, capacity mismatches and conflicts between this value and the diversity and equity goals. So to wrap up, there were all these theoretical values, 4 main ones, that both the designers of the system and the school district had. In practice, you know, and theoretically, the mechanism was meeting all of those values. In practice, we found there were a lot of issues. And so moving forward, you know, what we called this in the paper is the assumptions that were made around, you know, the problem being that there were assumptions made about thinking that these theoretical things are going to meet those values, but when you look at it in the real world, those assumptions were not correct. So moving forward, we've been thinking about a lot about what does it actually look like to implement distributive justice in student assignment. One of the main things that came out of our research was that providing relevant and accessible information was really important. This is also reflected a lot in the econ literature. So there's a lot of talk about information asymmetry as being a problem. But one of the things that we found in a large study in Oakland, which just came out in CSCW, is that the interventions that people were making to create information, to reduce information asymmetry, looked a lot like these dashboards, which were generic, they targeted a broad audience, and they made a lot of assumptions about what parents should look for in schools, for instance, standardized test scores. And what we found that, you know, really low income kids and their families in Oakland needed was personalized support. So they needed trusting relationships, they needed someone who's familiar with the family's circumstances, they needed a connection to other resources like food and housing. And a lot of what they were actually seeking was longer term social change. So that was one. Another thing that we're working on is how do we realign the algorithmic objectives with community goals in mind? How do we reconsider how stakeholders express their needs and constraints? And how do we make appropriate, reliable avenues for recourse available? And this has some implications for value-sensitive algorithm design. When you think about, you know, how do we involve stakeholders early and often? You need to think about flexibility and adaptability as a value in design as well. I think there's a big, you know, there's a big finding here around broadening our evaluations. So when the way that the original algorithm was evaluated was what percentage of people are getting their top choice. When in practice, you see that that doesn't actually meet all of the values that it was set out to meet. And so I think that we need to do a lot more work in thinking about algorithmic evaluation and how do we bring together quantitative and qualitative evaluations in practice for these algorithmic systems. And then the final one is thinking about interrogating implicit politics within these systems and thinking about design justice and also accepting refusal as a valid response to an algorithmic system. So these are the 2 papers I just presented. One of them just won the recognition for contribution to diversity and inclusion at CSCW, and the other was presented at CAD. So these are the 2 systems that I talked about today. I tried to use restorative justice and distributive justice as frameworks for thinking about 2 real-world computation systems and how they might fail and how we might be able to move them more towards acting in a just way. For the student assignment work, we're actually moving a little bit away from distributive justice, and our more recent work is trying to look at procedural justice as an alternative, thinking about what are the processes by which we create these systems and evaluate them. So thank you so much for listening, and I'm really looking forward to it.
Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. We're happy to take questions over Zoom, and in person. There's already one question over Zoom. If Sanket, you want to.
Herman, do you want to ask a question directly?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much for your sharing this research. I think it's really interesting. So my question is, I was wondering if you can use the restorative justice approaches to mitigate misinformation in online communities. So for example, when somebody said false claim online, like vaccines doesn't work or vaccine cause harm, I was wondering if you can like.
Herman, I'm so sorry. The speaker cut out for a little bit. Do you mind repeating the question?
Sure, let me just switch my speaker. Sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
So yeah, I was wondering if we can use restorative justice approaches to mitigate misinformation online in online communities. Like when somebody say false claim online, like vaccines doesn't work or vaccine cause harm to people. I was wondering if we can borrow the principles from the approaches that you talked about earlier to counter misinformation.
Thank you, Aaron, for that question. So the question is, how can we use?
Anyone hear my question?
Yeah, I'm just gonna repeat it, so make sure everyone heard it. Can we use restorative justice as a framework to think about misinformation? I think you absolutely could. I am not going to pretend that I've thought a lot about that, but if you think about the principles of restorative justice and sort of asking the three central questions: who's been heard, what are their needs, and whose obligation is to meet those needs? I think you could definitely apply that to other kinds of problems. I think a first step in thinking about that, which I actually think is a very productive step, is thinking about who are the main people who have been heard by this information, and how do we hear them better. And I actually think there have been some efforts similar to that. Like I remember throughout BLM, I think some Black leaders met with these representatives, and I think that has any sort of business feel in it, and thinking about, you know, there's a lot of misinformation that's harming this community. There's a lot of the content moderation algorithms that are harming this community. And so it makes a lot of sense to center those people who are hurt the most and think about, you know, what are their needs. And oftentimes a very, very first need is stopping the harm, so stopping the continuation of the harm. So I think that would be something to think more about in a misinformation as well. And, you know, one of the things that I want to also mention is that I talked a lot about restorative justice. There's also a lot of critiques to restorative justice, and there are alternatives as well. So transformative justice is another framework that tries to ask some of the more structural questions of what is creating the conditions for harm, and how do we solve that? So a transformative justice critique to restorative justice would be something like, yes, someone, you know, maybe stole something because of poverty. Then is it really repairing the harm to like have them return it but not solve the property question? So transformative justice tries to get more of those underlying questions. But I think with a lot of the misinformation problems that we're dealing with, it might be much more of a transformative justice question. And, you know, what are the underlying issues and conditions that create a culture where this sort of information thrives, like maybe mistrust in scientific sources like one. And so it would be a question of, you know, how do we deal with that cultural question, which is a much, much harder question than, you know, how do we deal with this one tweet that's spreading misinformation? And so that requires, you know, cultural work and, you know, activist work, which is very hard and takes a lot of time, but is absolutely necessary.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for the talk, and it's really good to see you. I'm really interested in the right to refusal that you mentioned, and also that in San Francisco they decided to take the system down and, you know, try again. What are the points in which we can refuse? Like, how would we build that into systems? There are a lot of systems that I would love to refuse, but there's no mechanism for that.
Yeah, great to see you too, I think, yeah, so I've done, thinking about refusal, when I mentioned it here was sort of not thinking that a matching algorithm has to be the only way to think about segregation. And actually, even thinking about segregation as a problem, a lot of people don't really agree with that. So is it really better to take a thriving Black school and force people to go to other schools just so that we can increase our diversity numbers? That's an open question. Some people say it's the only way to redistribute resources, some people say it's not. So I think, as people who are building these systems and really, a lot of us are the people who would go work with the school district to build the system to implement those values. And think for ourselves, we have to think through, questioning the actual values themselves and questioning whether the system is the best way to meet those values. Refusal, I think, relies on people power, much less so than I think it's something that we can build into a system. But I think, there's refusal of just like, let's stop using this whole system altogether and burn it all down. The refusal can also be in smaller things, like let's move it this way or in that direction. And I think thinking through, advocating for involving stakeholders earlier on in the process, thinking about whose values are we representing, whose voice are we bringing in. Some of our work right now, we're actually working with San Francisco Unified to do community engagement with them. So trying to bring those voices in and amplify them more and continue ways to do smaller refusals along the way.
Thank you.
Let's do one question on Zoom and then one question in person, and I think that might be all we have time for. Alyssa, if you would like to ask.
Yeah, thanks very much for this talk. It was wonderful. I was curious, particularly thinking back to one of the examples you gave early in the talk around intimate image abuse. I was curious, in terms of restorative or transformative justice approaches, sort of if there are any ways in which you think these can kind of scale, or where there is a role for sort of automated tech to play, or by nature is that maybe like not the right approach? I was curious if you could comment maybe a little bit more on that.
Yeah, so the question is it that we should just completely refuse automated ways of dealing with intimate violence, intimate partner violence, or image-based abuse, or are there ways to use that? I think there actually probably is. I'm not advocating for just throwing it all out. I'm advocating for rethinking. Well, one thing that I think is really, really, really important is that our only mechanism. So I'm an advocate of thinking about a toolbox and what are all the levers that we have available and how can we pull them all at the same time. So I think there are probably cases where someone would like to take their images taken down to as many websites as possible, and we should think about that and also think about how we do that cross-platform, because it's very frequently happening across multiple different websites and platforms, and we don't have a mechanism for coordinating efforts of that nature across platforms right now. But at the same time, thinking about that's not the only thing that someone in that position would want. It's probably not the first thing that they would want. And how do we think about the range of needs, especially around sentencing, emotional support, validation, which is usually the first thing that they need. And then thinking about what are their avenues, what are the things that they can do, what are the resources available, how do we connect them to those? So it's less of a like, don't do this, it doesn't work at all, and more of like, this is one of the things that potentially works in some cases. Let's think about the range of things that we need relative to the depth and importance of the problem and how difficult and intractable it actually is.
Thank you.
Good question. And then there's so many questions, so hopefully you'll get to have time to talk later. Lizana, would you like to?
Thank you so much for the talk. I really enjoyed that. I have a question about lines with restorative justice to online harm. And we thought of like the harm being like one to many, so essentially a single individual is harming maybe not like another individual, but a whole group of society, groups of people, or like ethnicities and so on, and how that can be restored. Because that seems like more challenging and kind of requiring them to measure, and like either through like the stereotypes, or maybe reinforcing stereotypes, or maybe like misaccount of like historical events.
Yeah, thank you for the question. The question is, a lot of what I talked about was, you could call it one-on-one harm or interpersonal harm. What about, one-to-many harm, like spreading stereotypes or racism? I think that falls a lot more under transformative justice when you think about like what are the underlying conditions that are causing this harm. I absolutely think that's important to think about as well. There's also the opposite that we've been thinking a little bit about, which is many-to-one harm, which is coordinated efforts and silencing someone or harassing them. I actually have a paper coming out about that, which focuses on journalists and activists who are facing these mass harassment campaigns. So I think there's a lot of different types of a problem that all should be worked on, and I really would love to see more work that takes restorative and transformative justice approach to thinking about the kind of problem that you were talking about. We sort of pick interpersonal harm as the first step or as an opening point, especially the problems around image-based harm, because that was the type of harm where everyone agreed that this is wrong and shouldn't happen. And still we don't really have a good way of addressing it. So I would love to see, more work looking at these different types of harm, and then for each of those, what do the people who harm need? Whose obligation is it? What sort of tools or resources would be helpful? I think that would be really great to see it and really good progress in this question.
Thank you so much, Niloufar, for the wonderful talk and for answering our questions. I'd just like to briefly announce our next speaker for November 7th will be Dr. Catherine Niloufar from University of Maryland. She'll be discussing applications of remote sensing and ML to food security, land use mapping, and climate change. Please join us then. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Also, if people vouchers for lunch, being